So, hey everyone, here I would like to deliver my presentation. The title is Depiction of Contemporary Women's Status in One Act Play Trifles by Susan Glaspell using Semiotic-Structuralism approach. Let me introduce myself. My name is Arum Puspita Sari with my last number is 090. And this is my final exam project. I am from Semiotics Class B. So I will deliver a breakdown analysis of women's status in Trifles. Next is about the table of content or points for discussion. First is introduction, second is the plot of the story, and the third is the main, namely analysis using the theory of pairs, and the last is conclusion. This is the introduction or the summary of the story. So basically, Trifles is one applies that portrays a murder mystery that written by Susan Glaspell. Actually, the story was inspired by a real murder case that she found when she was a journalist. To be specific, this story was about the investigation of a murder case of John Wright, who is found dead, strangled by a rope in the kitchen of his farmhouse. Several neighbors and a sheriff tries to investigate and find the Wright's wife. Minnie is suspected of the murder because she didn't report on the death of her husband and the lack of evidence. Mrs. Minnie Wright has been arrested. After that, there are several people who are looking for evidence against the story, namely Sheriff Henry Peters and his wife, Mrs. Peters, County Attorney George Henderson, and Mr. Hale and his wife, Mrs. Hale. Some evidence of murder was seen in several places around his house, but it was considered as a trivial matter for the man. Despite that, the woman who see the evidence as a distinct case that reveals many untold misery and suffering, with the proof of woman evidence, and reveal the truth such as the caged bird and the canning jars of fruit, the dirty towel and the quilt and the dead bird cannery, things that were considered trivials by the man. It does glimpse of issue between men and women over the investigation and questioning about a woman's status in contemporary society, because as the story follows, men described as a dominant gender. It described when a male figure tries to make fun of the little evidence and consider women matters to be a trivials, where women are neglected, ignored, and generally disregarded by the men, so it indicates a gender inequality between them. As the scene when the woman assumed that there was a cause why Minnie murdered her husband, they thought there is a domestic violence between John Wright and her wife, because Mrs. Wright is known as a good woman who will like to sing. This analysis will be delivered by using a theory of pure semiotic structuralism. With the evidence of this case, it is believed that those things are content assigned that indicated a hidden meaning, as the pure stories about sign are classified into three sections, such as iconic, indexical, and symbolic. Also, it will focus on the trivial literary devices. Next is the plot. The first is exposition. It is starting from the mysterious murder of Mr. White, and all the residents gather together in the messy kitchen of Mr. White. Then all the people are dreary to find out the cause of the incident, continuing with the real investigation that was initiated by the sheriff and his wife, county attorney, also Mr. Hale and Mrs. Hale. They are trying to find evidence for the case. However, Mrs. Wright, or commonly called by Mrs. Minnie, is in jail as she suspected that she was killed her husband with strangled in a rope. The second part is tracing action. The men hound for clues to prove that Mrs. Wright is the culprit, but instead they made sexist comments on Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Assuming that all the evidence of the woman found are only trivials, Mrs. Hale is increasingly engaged in searching the evidence, while Mrs. Peters are actually depending the sadness that Mr. Wright felt, because she thought that Mr. Wright is miserable because she has experienced a domestic violence during her marriage life. The first major complication occurred when the woman found a dead bird canary and most likely killed by Mr. Reich, which is the evidence of Mrs. Reich's motive for killing her husband. The third part is climax. While gathering to search building materials, the woman came across a small box. It was wrapped in silk and evidently it contained a dead bird canary. The bird neck has been wrung. Then it was proven that a hidden sign was revealed which indicated that Minnie's husband didn't like the canary beautiful song, which means a symbol of his wife's desire for freedom and happiness. Presumably, Mr. Wright removed the canary from the cage and strangled it. So the next is falling action. The highest point was when Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Peters decided to hide the dead bird canary from the sheriff and county attorney and also the other people. Because Mrs. Hill stuffed the box with the dead bird into her coat pocket, it is just because the woman wants to defend Mrs. Wright because they thought that Mrs. Wright is not entirely wrong in this case. There's a motive behind it, namely a domestic violence that she felt. This becomes a part of the falling action. And the resolution here, at the end of the story, Mrs. Hill comments on the county attorney while she showed the man about the dead bird canary in her pocket. Mrs. Hill did this to prove that the little item that she found had a real casual relationship and served as an accurate evidence, not unlike what the man thought they would mention as a trivial things. The man has nothing to do, but we know that the woman won this round, so actually the story was solved. Next, about the analysis. As I told before, I use the theory of peers, and the first section is iconic. This sign resembles its reference, such as a picture of a ship, a map, and so on. So from the script of the story, there are several items that are considered in iconic category of Peirce theory, which means this one resembles the reference or the original items such as the gold cunning jars of fruit, the quill, the dead bird of canary, the dirty towel, and the cage. And the next is andexical. It is a sign that associated or possibly causally, for instance, smoke as a sign of fire and cloud as a sign of rain and so on. So basically, I found two indexical category in this story. The first is domestic violence. The main cause that encouraged Minnie to kill her husband is because she openly get abused from her husband. It can be seen from the woman's investigation, which show that Minnie often received domestic violence as evidenced by the death of her beloved bird, the canary. And the old house, it can be seen in the text that the condition of the Mr. White house are dirty and dusty. It described that this house hasn't been occupied for a long time because Mr. Wright has dead and Mrs. Wright, his wife, are arrested. And the next section is symbolic. Actually, it is a sign that has an arbitrary relation to its reference. For example, is language as a symbol of identity or knowledge, and a flag is a symbol of nation, and so on. So the first symbol is Trifles. It is a title of the play that concerns about women, which the men consider to be only trivials. All the evidence, namely canning jars of red, that Minnie Rex is related to the murder, as well as the quilt and the other items that Minnie asked to have brought to her at the trial. Trifles symbolize the importance of meaning to the topics. Also, all the stuff is considered as a hidden sign, as this woman break the riddle and get an insight to understand the motive of Minnie's crime. Over and over, the men constantly assume that women's interests are trivial and unimportant. They assume that those things are not important in the investigation of John Rex's murder and to the importance of women concern and situation in general. It can be seen that the status of women in expressing their ideas is not existent. Men are often underestimated as if women have no rights. So the proof here, when Mr. Hill said, well, women are used to worrying over trifles. And the second symbol is the cage bird. It symbolizes the woman in the play. It also represents for almost women in society. In the early 20th century, women were described as the cage bird, where they just do motherhood and wifehood like housekeeping. And women get an equality for all aspects of the society, such as education, equality to men in rights, work pay, and especially for the suffrage. And the third symbol is the dead bird canary. So actually, this dead-bird canary is the strangle songbird that Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Peters discover, explain the motivation behind Minnie Rex's crime, but also symbolize John Rex's abusive treatment of his wife. Minnie is linked to the bird through Mrs. Hill's memory of her as a young unmarried woman who liked to sing. Like the dead bird, Minnie was once bright and filled with life, but this energy was strangled out her by life with John Rex, where her married life got in patriarchal society, living with a harsh man. The bird also symbolized many need to companionship in her childless home, and the death of the bird showed that John not only didn't acknowledge these needs, but actually removed her remaining search of happiness in cruel and brutal way. Also, it is a symbol of lost freedom. It is caged, broken during one of John Rock's rage. It is a symbolic of Minnie's marriage, which isolates her from her community and society. The third symbol is the dirty towel. It is one of many out-of-place objects in Minnie's kitchen that caused George Henderson to accuse her of being poor housekeeper. The disarray of Minnie's kitchen demonstrates a distressed mind and that Minnie's act of killing her husband was more emotional and traumatic than her demeanor indicates. In addition, the mess in the kitchen symbolizes the ways in which the men in this play expect women to fulfill certain gender roles. Minnie is held responsible for the state of the house and is seen as an unfit for her role of wife. As a result, it is precisely the source of judgment and the fact that the men are so comfortable in judging women that isolates Minnie in their house. And the next symbol is the candy jars of fruit. It represents Minnie's extreme concern over her role as wife and her household responsibilities. This concern is the product of the pressure society has placed on her as a woman and wife, teaching her to fear the judgment of men if she doesn't adequately fulfill her expected role. This fear is clearly justified as the men rebuke her housekeeping abilities while also laughing at the other woman's concern over trifles. The women are judged for good too much concern and too little concern about housekeeping. Minnie is worried that the canning jars will break and her hard work will be ruined. And in their inspection of the house, Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Peters discover that this has indeed happened. Their decision to lie to Minnie and say that the jars have not broken establish the canning jars as a symbol of Minnie's situation, her pain, and her nearly certain sentence. The canning jars are broken as Minnie feared, and they symbolize the inevitability of her conviction. The women's in to the point of working against the concern of preferences of their husband. By the end of the story, Mrs. Hill and Mr. Peter actively attempt to protect Minnie by concealing the evidence against her. Their instinct to protect her against the men who have judged her is first shown in their agreement to lie to her about her canning jars. The next symbol is the quilt. It happened when Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Peters decided to bring the quilt for Minnie in jail. This quilt had been working by Minnie. The woman wondered about Minnie's decision to finish this quilt in one or two styles, either quilting or nothing. In my opinion, it can be referred to a metaphor for her innocence or her guilt. The quilt can be defined as her defense mechanism of her marriage life that she often felt a domestic violence. In other words, the act of nothing or can symbolize the act of her ending up killing her husband with a rope around his neck. And Mrs. Hill tries to answer the county attorney question regarding how Minnie was going to finish her quilt. Mrs. Hale said, "We call it not it, Mr. Henderson." Meanwhile, the men are blinded with all his arrogance and inability. Another one of the trifles that the men do live only concern women. This male's character executed with the extreme prejudice against the arrested woman having Mrs. Hill and Mrs. Peters' wife, Mrs. Peters interrogated. So the proof is when Mrs. Peters said she was piercing a quilt, and Mrs. Hill said, "It is a long cabin pattern, pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just nodded." And the sheriff laughed. They wondered if she was going to quilt or just nodded. The next is conclusion. So according to the story of the Trifles, it is clear that the main issue raised in this story is feminism. Unexpectedly, the issue of women's status in the contemporary era is very strong in the story because it relates to the author's own goal, namely to Glaspell, who wants to uphold a general justice and general rules at the time. By bringing up the three male characters who underestimate women and regard women as a trivial things that related to the investigation into the murder of Mr. Wright, contrary to the character of a woman who tried to be as detailed as possible to find evidence that turns out to be true and all the things are related to each other. All the small pieces of evidence have a connection that led to the motive for this murder. The mysterious truth that Minnie is believed to be a frequent victim to domestic violence, that her beloved Jack Henry has destroyed her happiness, the way Mr. Wright killing the bird by twisting its neck affects how Minnie kills her husband, and that's probably marked by the blanket. So Mr. Wright looks like the freedom that Minnie got when she finally left the toxic marriage life. With this evidence from the woman, the significance object is analyzed by using semiotic-structuralism approach theory by peers that observe the meaning of the language used in the story. This can be identified in several ways, one of which is based on the symbols that are found in the story. Also, the metaphors and similes that the authors use in the story supports women's status in contemporary society, such as the dead bird cannery, the quill, the dirty towel, the broken canning jars, and so on. So actually, I used three references for this presentation, as you can see on the screen. So I think that's all from me. Thank you for your time and your consideration. And feel free to give me a comment and suggestion. So see you. Stay healthy, everyone.